For today's sermon, our passages is going to be Leviticus chapter 1, verse 1 to verse 2. And the Lord called unto Moses and spoke to him out of the tabernacle of the congregation, saying, Speak to the people of Israel, and say to them, When any one of you brings an offering to the Lord, you will bring your offering of livestock from the herd or from the flock. Amen. As this week begins with Mother's Day, today's sermon will focus on the priests of Leviticus relating to God as their father. So if you remember from previous sermons, in the Bible, priest of God is another way of saying sons of God. So priests have a sonship identity in relating with God. Sometimes instead of saying priests, the Bible will just outright call them sons of God. Now, a couple examples are Genesis chapter 6, verse 2, where it says, The sons of God saw the daughters of men. And Romans chapter 8, verse 14, where it says, For as many as are led by the Spirit of God, they are the sons of God. So priests relate to God as sons by their priestly duties. What are priestly duties? What are the priests responsible for and responsible to do? There's a great and huge overlap between what priests do as priests and what they do as the children of God. So I'm going to make the priest sermons into two parts, the priesthood sermons. Today is going to focus on priests as relating to God as sons because it's Mother's Day. So we'll take a look at the responsibilities of the priests as children of God. And next week we'll take a look at the priests' responsibilities or their identity as priests. So a priest's responsibility as children of God is to bear God's image. As sons of God, the priest's identity, who he is God's image bearer, somebody who carries God's image on him. In other words, the holiness of God expressed by God's glory is given to all priests so that they can carry with them God's glory in order to show God's holiness. By definition, a priest is a person or a people who take on God's holiness as their identity. It's who they are. God's holiness identifies them. So the first priest, Adam, was made in God's image because he was the firstborn of God. This means he carried on him God's glory, God's holiness, just by being made in God's image. And Adam, as the firstborn of God, took on God's holiness as his identity. And then physically taken out of Adam, specifically Adam's rib, his bone and his flesh, Eve was also made a child of God because she was taken from Adam's flesh and bone, who God considered his firstborn. And this is why in the Bible God says that both Adam and Eve were both made in God's image. And if you read Genesis 1 carefully, verse 27 says God created man in his own image. That's one person. One man, one image of God. So verse 27 says, So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, God created him. So this is like second grade grammar. When it's talking about him, it's talking about one person. Him is a one person pronoun, the one man. But the rest of the verse then says, Male and female, God created them. So the way God is seeing Adam and Eve is, Adam is God's firstborn son. Eve is made from Adam's bone, which means she can be considered a clone of Adam. But at the same time, God adds changes to Eve so that she's different from Adam even while she's the same as Adam. So Eve is the same as Adam, but at the same time she's different. This is how God created Eve out of Adam. So God sees them both as God's image because God made Adam in God's image, and Eve is made from Adam, who was made in God's image. So what responsibility does the son have towards his parents? Hyodo, to revolve their life around their parents' will. So if you remember, the biblical idea of the fifth commandment to honor your father and your mother isn't to just do what they say, but to actually revolve your thoughts and revolve your will around their will. And I know your parents aren't perfect, and not all parents are good. I know this. I know there's bad parents, and these are all the effects of sin. Parents being bad, it's because of the effects of sin. If Adam and Eve had children before they sinned, there would be no such thing as bad parents, because all the parents would follow God's will and raise their children to do God's will. And in that kind of world, to revolve your life around your parents would be honoring them, and your parents would be telling you to revolve your life around God's will. So everything would have been good. But because of sin, in our fallen world now, we can only do the best we can to do what's right in God's eyes. And this is to do good towards your parents and obey them as much as possible. But this doesn't excuse us from not doing hyodo towards our parents. We can't use the current sinful state of humanity as an excuse not to do hyodo towards our parents, not to revolve our life around their will. So doing hyodo towards your parents is doing hyodo towards God, because by learning to revolve your thoughts and your will around your parents, you learn to revolve your thoughts and your will around God. So your parents are sort of like a practice, a way you practice how you're supposed to do Hilda towards God. And this is the responsibility of the children of God, to do Hilda towards God. So the responsibility of priests as sons of God is Hilda towards God. This means keeping God's will, even if it means denying my own will. So in Leviticus chapter 10, Aaron's two sons, Nadab and Abihu, who went to Mount Sinai with Moses and Aaron. And if you'll remember, the rest of the Israelites they couldn't enter into the mountain, but there were 70 elders, and then Nadab and Abihu, who are Aaron's sons, they were allowed to go with Aaron, with Moses, into the mountain, and then Moses went by himself to the top of the mountain to receive the commandments from God. So, so these two, Nadab and Abihu, they went with Moses and Aaron. They were doing their priestly stuff, but they were not careful in doing as God commanded them. So they put incense lit from a different fire than the one that God provided on the altar, and fire went out from God and burned them alive, so that they died in front of God for offering the strange fire. So Aaron and his two other sons, his two younger sons, had to finish the priestly duties in finishing the sacrifices and then eating the meat of the sin offering, the sin sacrifices. But instead of following through with the rest of the sacrifice offering, Aaron tells his sons to stop, not go any further. And Moses questions Aaron why he didn't continue his priestly duties. And this is how Aaron responds. He says, since they offered the sin offerings, and the fact that his first two sons are dead, and because of that he's grieving in his heart, Aaron's concern was if he and his sons continued to eat the sin offering and continued with the sin sacrifices, his direct quote is, quote, should it have been accepted in the sight of the Lord, unquote. And this is from Leviticus chapter 10, verse 19. So for Aaron, the high priest of God, the representative firstborn of God, even though his sons died, his main concern was whether or not his actions would be acceptable to God, having grief in his heart because of the thoughts of God's holiness and his glory in his heart. So if you go back to Exodus chapter 28, verse 36, and Exodus chapter 39, verse 30, the high priest was to wear a mitre. That's a headwear, in which a gold plate was made on the forehead, and on the gold plate was written, Holiness to the Lord, on it, that the high priest was supposed to wear in front of God. So on the forehead of the headwear of the high priest, the gold plate says, Holiness to the Lord, and the high priest is supposed to wear this when he does anything in the tabernacle of God all the time, because his mind is supposed to be filled with God's holiness as he performed his priestly duty and offered sacrifices for himself and the sins of God's people. And Aaron, being God's high priest, thinks about whether or not his heart and actions should be acceptable to God, thinking about God's holiness, because his heart was filled with grief from his two sons dying from not following God's directions. So we would think, Aaron is concerned about Aaron is grieving because of his sons, and that's why he's not performing his priestly duties. But actually, in Aaron's mind, he's thinking, because of the grief in his heart, he's now not totally thinking about God's holiness in his heart and mind. So there's things other than God that he's thinking about, and he's concerned about whether or not that's acceptable to God. So for Aaron, that's the most important thing right now as the high priest of God, not whether or not he is grieving or not grieving, but whether or not the fact that he's grieving, this other thing is now filling up his heart, when at the moment that he's supposed to be doing his priestly duties, only the holiness of God is supposed to be in his heart, right? That's why the high priest has to wear the headgear with the plate that says, the golden plate that says, holiness to the Lord. His thoughts at the time he's performing his priestly duties are only supposed to be about God's holiness. But right now there's other things filling his mind, so he's concerned that it's not acceptable to God. And this is the identity of the children of God, the priests of God. Children of God think about God's will at all times, even denying their own will in order to do God's will. The sons of God take God's will, their Father's will, that seriously. And that's what Aaron the high priest is showing right now in Leviticus chapter 10. They care for it that much, that even if they're, especially for Aaron, even though his sons died, his concern isn't that his sons died. His concern is that now that his heart is grieved by his sons dying, because now it's not, his mind is not wholly thinking about God's holiness, whether or not that mindset is acceptable to God. And that's how the sons of God should be thinking. So then later, when we get to the New Testament, you'll be able to see why Jesus kept repeating over and over that everything he did only because, or he only did it because he was doing his Father's will. So why did Jesus heal people? In order to do his Father's will. Well, why did Jesus preach the gospel? To do his Father's will. In fact, Jesus says his Father sent him specifically to preach the gospel. So then why did Jesus walk on water? Because it's Father's will. Why did Jesus eat? Because of his Father's will. Why did Jesus sleep? Because of his Father's will. And all of this is anticipated in Leviticus, which tells us things that the priests did, what happened to priests, and what they were commanded by God as priests, as sons of God. The priests, as sons of God, are anticipating what God's only begotten Son, Jesus Christ, would do, what needed to be done when he comes on earth as the perfect Son of God, the perfect high priest of God. So as you learn more about the book of Leviticus, I hope you guys can see why it's such an important book for us to read and understand, as it anticipates much of what Jesus Christ came to do, how we're supposed to live as children of God, as priests of God.